Answer. I understand it is the government's intention to introduce an impressed supply bill.
First for 2010-11 bill, introduction.
The bill is set down for first reading forthwith. The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, I move that the impressed supply first for 2010-11 bill be now read a first time.
The question is that motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it.
Impressed supply first for 2010-11 bill, first reading.
The bill is set down for second reading forthwith. I call on Government Order of the Day number 1.
Appropriation 2009-10 Supplementary Estimates Bill, second reading.
The Honourable Bill
Speaker.
English.
Mr Speaker, I move that the Appropriation 2009-10 Supplementary Estimates Bill and the impressed supply first for 2010-11 bill be now read a second time. Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, this is an opportunity about a month after the budget to reflect on just where the New Zealand economy is going and what needs to be done to get it into shape. Mr Speaker, it's a common view that the New Zealand economy was getting along all right until late 2008, and then it got hit by the global recession, and now we are recovering from that recession. Well, that is only part of the story. The other part of the story is just as important, and that is the story about what happened to this economy from about 2004-2005. And what happened was that our earning capacity shrank. The tradable sector of this economy in the 5 years from 2004 shrank by 10%, and our spending capacity grew. In fact, it grew by about 15% in the 5 years from 2004. Now, clearly that is unsustainable. We cannot continue to maintain an economy where our growth in spending and consumption is significantly faster than our growth in earning capacity, or in fact, as happened, our shrinkage in earning capacity. And Mr Speaker, the country has done what any household or individual does when it spends more than it earns. It borrows to cover the difference. And that borrowing has now become really quite extensive. One measure of it is a measure called the net international investment position. And this is really a measure of what New Zealand owes to the world. And what we owed to the world back in 2000 was about $90 billion. Currently it is around $170 billion that we owe to overseas lenders. And the forecasts that take into account the impact of recession tell us that by 2014 we could owe the rest of the world $250 billion, or in American numbers, around about $250 billion. And Mr Speaker, the symptoms of that became particularly obvious in the second half of this decade. We saw a property boom, a boom in speculation in which many New Zealanders were caught up. That property boom was financed by our banks borrowing overseas. In effect, our households borrowing with our banks as the intermediary. We also saw a big upsurge in government spending from about the middle of the decade. Both of these combined together pushed interest rates to pretty much record levels since the early 90s, and the exchange rate to the highest 5-year moving average since the Second World War. So the effect of that was to suppress our export sector. It's no bigger now than it was in 2002, and there's been no net new jobs in the export sector for 10 years. In fact, in the pure export sector, as I explained in question time today, we actually have about 40,000 less jobs over recent years. So New Zealand has borrowed to cover the difference between a shrinking earning capacity through a shrinking export sector, and a fast-growing spending capacity through out-of-control government and a property boom. Mr Speaker, the borrowing that adds up to our net international investment position is a concern. It's not an immediate pressing issue, but it is a concern for the same reasons that extensive debt bothers a household or a family or a business. First, we have to pay the interest. That shows up through our current account deficit. So this economy, when it rolls out of bed on Monday morning, has to meet the interest bill on $170 billion owed to foreign lenders before it does anything else, before we can buy back assets, before we can invest in our own businesses, before we can make the capital investment that might create a new job. We have to spend the first 6 or 7% of GDP servicing our debt to foreign lenders. And the second reason we worry about it is simply that it represents a vulnerability in a world where lenders are getting grumpy. I don't think there's any doubt about that. If you follow the financial markets from day to day, we are seeing regular headlines now about countries and businesses within countries that are struggling to borrow the money they need from global financial markets. And of course New Zealand does not want to get in that position. So the budget we've just had is one step, and I'd say it's only one step, down a path to reducing our vulnerability to our overseas lenders if we possibly can, and that'll be a long-term job, increasing our growth rates and ensuring that we get a recovery which helps to rebalance the economy. And the budget started that process of rebalancing. We made it clear that we can't afford to have another cycle where people borrow, where people spend too much, borrow excessively, speculate on property, and where investment and the export sector effectively shrink. That is just simply not on for New Zealand in the next 10 years. So we made a decision in the budget to change the incentives through the tax system. And the changes in the tax system are unambiguously aimed at discouraging excessive consumption and property speculation and encouraging, through lower tax rates, more investment, more jobs and more savings. But Mr Speaker, that is one part of the program. Another part of the program is that, as expressed in the budget, is that we have to get hold of the quantity and quality of public spending. While households have been spending more than they earn for a fair bit of the last decade, until 2008, the government was actually bringing in more revenue than it was spending and running surpluses. That position started reversing from 1 January from the budget 2008, before the global financial crisis, and as the government has decided to absorb the shock of this recession on its balance sheet, as it's decided to protect New Zealanders from the sharp edges of recession, our government is now running up deficits and running up debt, which is contributing to New Zealand's vulnerability. So the budget does focus on containing the growth of government spending. And I think that by and large, pretty well everyone in New Zealand accepts that now is the time to do that after 10 years of plenty in the state sector. Probably the Labour opposition are the only people in the country who believe that government should keep the spending tap open, let it flow regardless of the quality of that spending, and send the bill to the next generation of workers through borrowing. So the budget sets out the limit on the growth of government spending. It also includes around about $1.8 billion of reprioritising of government spending. That is, shifting spending from low quality and in some cases quite ineffective programs to high quality, more effective frontline services. Mr Speaker, the business of rebalancing the New Zealand economy is, in my view, about a 10-year job. The early signs are promising. Households aren't going on a spending binge. spending binge. They're not rushing back to the housing market. They've been careful about their borrowing on the one hand.